So here we go, and I'll turn it over to Tom. There you go. So there you go. Can you hear us, Amy?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Tom, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, dear Hart, for that splendid introduction. As Bela Lugosi's Dracula would say, good evening. As I would say, welcome to the monkey farm of geopolitics. So here we go.
Okay.
See
I'll
if I
do
can
it. Let me do this
master
part.
this machine here.
Here we go. I'm going to help a little
My
bit.
granddaddy used to say, stay away from that shovel boy, you don't know nothing about machinery. And so I'm really dependent on my lovely and brilliant wife to help me with this. And here we go. I'm going to present, this is going to be a rather long night, I think, for me. I would say about 55 minutes. And in order to understand what's happening now, I think you have to understand as well what has happened in Russia, because Russians know this history very well, of course, and Putin has bent this history to his particular ideological needs, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So the presentation topics are things I'll try to cover, some in more depth than others. Russian history and what Putin wants, perception and consensus of Russian elite by 2000 on foreign policy in support of Putin. What I call the sinews or the muscles and the justificatory ideology of Putin, which is important to understand because this ideology closed his particular narrative.
That the special master had to go back to
Putin's imperial ideology in some detail. I'll talk about that. And then focus on Putin's war against Ukraine, but also try to give you some sense of the relationship between Ukraine war and Sino-Russian alliance and Ukraine war. This alliance is now 20 years old, and recently Putin met with Xi Jinping, actually today, back then in Uzbekistan. And I'll say something about that as well. And I'll talk a little bit about Russia's popular support for Putin's war, and then how could the Ukraine war end. Let me start out by saying what Putin wants, or what his agenda, his expansive agenda is. Putin, and he's been very clear about this for the most part for the last 10 to 15 years. Russia, for Putin, would rule over the new Slavic Union, a new Slavic Union of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. That would be the core of an empire. He would try to bring together all the former Soviet states, which would recognize the political and economic hegemony of Russia under his rule. He would also try to bring together into a much larger Eurasian empire some southern elements. He would do this as a way of building this Eurasian empire that he talks about in virtually every speech now. This is more than a system of influence, as Fiona Hill and Angela Stent have said. It's much more than a sphere of influence. It's with a mixture, it's a sphere of control with a mixture of outright territorial reintegration into an empire of his creation. He has put forth a narrative history of his own to justify and to explain why Russia is doing this, why he is doing this. Now, Putin is an extremely well-read man, and he's read virtually every book that needs to be read about Russian history and European history and world history. And he peppers then his essays, he peppers his speeches with references to that history as he's building his own particular view of history as a justification for invading the Ukraine. Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians have a common origin, he says. True enough. But they have a different history and culture, but that's not what he says. Ukrainians have never been sovereign, he argues. That is simply not true. The Bolsheviks robbed Russia of the Ukraine by creating the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was reaffirmed by Khrushchev. And Putin's very critical of both the Bolsheviks and Khrushchev for giving some kind of independence to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And the other part of this history is that Russia has been a victim again and again of Western Europe and other influences from the East, but primarily now the US and Western Europe regards the Ukraine as a platform to threaten, invade, and control Russia. This is his history that he's trying to sell. I want to start by saying to examine this, the context and some of his ideas and some of the sources of his strength and his power by quoting Timothy Snyder. I will quote him several times in this presentation because I consider him, after reading his book called The Bloodlands, about all of the conflicts in Eastern Europe and Russia over several centuries. He has recently published an extremely interesting article in Foreign Affairs. He says this, and I agree entirely with this. The war in Ukraine is a test of whether a tyranny that claims to be a democracy can triumph and thereby spread its logical and ethical vacuum, as he calls it. Those who took democracy for granted were sleepwalking towards a tyranny. This is a historical note on his part. The Ukrainian resistance is the wake-up call. A Russian victory would strengthen fascists and tyrants around the world. And he goes into much more detail about this in his book, but I entirely agree with this. Let me first talk about some of the continuing themes in Russian memory and history that we see manifested again now in Putin's policies and in the expansionary ambitions. Russia does have a terrible concern and has been in search for centuries for security and Russian expansion. For many Russians, not just Putin, but the autocrats of the old Russian Empire. Russian expansion is a way to deal with this question of security. The role of the Russian Orthodox Church, another extremely important theme in Russian history, topic, if you will, for consideration, in creation of Russian culture and civilization has been extremely important. But important as well is the relationship that developed between the church and the state. And I would call that Caesaropapism, which means that the church serves the interest of the autocrat and the state first and foremost. And this is precisely what Putin has tried to do with the Orthodox Church in the last 25 years. Social conflicts have occurred. Civil wars have occurred, like the time of Troubles in the early part of the 18th century. And there have been cycles of reform to deal with these internal uprisings and so on. But all of the reform and revolution has been from above, from the Tsar and the strongman, whoever's in power, down. So strongman rule and national unity has been a continuing theme. This is not new at all with Putin. I'll say a few words about that in another context. Westernization and its discontents in Russia. What do I mean by that? Russia has dealt with Westernization in a way that they could learn something, but at the same time have not always been glad about the way Westerners have looked at Russia. But most of the reformers that have come forth are the revolutionaries up until the establishment of the Soviet Union have been people who brought Western models and that sort of thing into Russia. And there have been cycles, very much like it seems to me Chinese history, cycles of making and remaking of empire. One of the things that you find when you go to Russia is Kremlins everywhere. Every major Russian city of any age at all has a Kremlin. It has a fort. It has a fort built around its government. And also fortifications built around its monasteries. What's that all about? What that is all about is that Russia has been invaded so many times from the east and from the west that fortification is absolutely necessary in the pre-industrial period for them to protect the church and what it stands for, and to protect the government. So just a little bit of a geography history and history lesson here about Russia. Look at this, this huge empire. It has been easily invaded. The Russians have been easily invaded from the west by the Germans. In fact, the Poles have the uncomfortable position historically of being between the Germans and the Russians. It has been easily invaded from the east through the Ural Mountains, which pose no obstruction for invading Asian groups that started long before the Mongols to move in this area. The Pechenegs and Politsy and various other groups. So Russia has, in a sense, been under siege from both sides for most of its history. So expansion and the need to administer Russia's vast territory, says Jeffrey Mankoff, a professor of Russian foreign policy, encourage the development of a powerful autocratic state. In contrast to England or the United States, Tsarist Russia's emergence has an imperial power, an imperial power was not driven by traders and merchants as expanding capitalism was in the West, but through military conquest in pursuit of power, security, and prestige. So Russia and Western Europe, a word or two more about that relationship over the last 500 years. From the early recorded time, this goes back to 900 or so, from the earliest of recorded history, Russia has been in Europe, but not wholly of it. Kievan Rus, for example, under Yaroslav the Wise in the 10th century, the first Russian state was Kievan Rus, was intimately involved in European diplomacy. And several of the daughters of this great prince of Kievan Rus were married into, for example, the French monarchy. So they were very much part of the West and had derived some, not thought, but certainly had derived alliances and had various kinds of relations with the West. Russian Orthodoxy, however, gave Russia an identity distinct from the Protestant countries in the West and became an ideological support of Russian autocracy for reasons I've talked about previously. So, invading Russia, 900 to 1945. As Markov has put it, lacking natural barriers such as mountains, ranges, Russian history is littered with attacks by foreign armies, including those of Vikings, Teutonic Knights, Genghis Khan and Mongol Tatar descendants, the Ottoman Turks, the French in the 19th century, and twice by the Germans in the 20th century. Moscow has had continuous conflicts, in other words, on the West with marauding Germans, Poles, Lithuanians, Swedes, and others. So you can understand then this concern about security on the part of Russia. It's almost genetic in a sense of this concern continuously as they study their history, as they experience their history, this concern for security. Jeffrey Hoskins, in a very short book that I highly recommend called Russian History, notes such images of conquest from East and West and occupation by the Tatars, for example, for 2 centuries of Russia have haunted the minds of the Russians over the centuries. They have been reenacted within living memory and the German invasion of 1941, whatever else they may have wanted. Russians have always longed for security, from terrifying and murderous assaults across the flat open frontiers to the East and West. They could not have unity and security, though, without restraining their own internal strongmen during periods of civil strife. So, moving way forward. This is the full extent of the Russian Empire before the revolution of 1917 and the dismemberment first, and then the reaffirmation of this empire under the Soviets from 1917 to 1991. This was the empire. The breakup of the Soviet Union meant, in a sense, not only that the Soviet Union would be alone in this landmass and dealing with all of the conflicts that might come its way, but it meant that this, as they looked at it, lock-shielded group of states, a kind of buffer against the West as they perceived it. And look where the Ukraine stands there in that particular place. Very strategic in terms of warfare going back and forth. This was considered to be the buffer for Russia by the Soviet Union, the leaders of the Soviet Union. And that's been lost. And in a sense, what Putin is trying to do is to reconstruct this. So the breakup of the Soviet Union, let me say a little bit about that, and Russia's new time of troubles, as I would call it, from 1990 to 2000. The United States and Western Europe treated Russia as a defeated enemy. You remember all of that, many of you, how Reagan was sort of crowing about it, and Clinton the same. Pursued policies to make Russia a capitalist society. This is what the West had to sell to Russia. They encouraged the breakup of the Soviet Empire and made aid to Russia contingent on the destruction of the state sector and the sell-off of natural resources and industrial firms and economic enterprises. The US and the West failed not only to give adequate aid for transition to some kind of liberal democratic society, but also encouraged economic shock therapy, which is to say, privatize all enterprises now, privatize virtually the whole economy, and cut all of the state subsidies to education and to health and that area, those areas, important areas out. Clear the deck for capitalism. The US and West encouraged the sale off of state enterprises and resources and knocked down prices, as it turned out, to insiders, most of them former Communist Party leaders who had lots of money, including the KGB, members of that sort of still emerging elite, new elite from the old Soviet period, were the insiders I'm talking about. And the result of that was a kind of crony capitalism, where 100 or less bought up the resources, bought the enterprises at prices that was set very low. The IMF loan contingent on the destruction of Soviet safety net the IMF loan was contingent on the destruction of the Soviet safety net for health, education, social services, and pensions. Widespread destruction and privatization of social services, extremely important in understanding how Russians were dealt with all of this. And the result was widespread poverty and massive decline of the standard of living. Further results, the Western failure to support the Russian ruble and other financial instruments eventually led to a precipitous economic decline, undermining President Yeltsin's attempt to create a democratic system. And he didn't help that much. And in 1993, he pushed the Constitution aside and by decree declared that the presidential office had more power than the Duma and all other institutions. But the Russian elite perceived that US and Western Europeans encouraged the former Soviet republics and former satellite states to apply for NATO membership. Most importantly, Russian elites blamed, and by the elites, I mean the intelligentsia, I mean the bureaucracy, I mean the oligarchs, I mean the security services, and so on. Most importantly, the Russian elites blamed the economic decline and creation of NATO protected border former republics on the United States and the West. So the question, just a moment, about NATO. A lot of misunderstanding about this, even I think in the West. Many American and European diplomats and experts on Russia encouraged the go slow policy on admitting former Soviet republics on Russia's border into NATO. They predicted correctly, and by the way, in the presentation, I predicted correctly, I think, that most Russians would see this as a hostile act aimed at their country. Richard Nixon predicted this. Russian leaders across the political spectrum were very critical of the benign neglect and disdain that the US Western allies demonstrated in the crucial 6 years after the break of the Soviet Union, and they blamed that on the West and on the United States. So the response of the Russian elite, independent of Putin, quite independent. By 2000, a widespread national Russian consensus across political and economic lines of the elite had emerged. Russia must go it alone and make itself a great power again. To achieve this, Russia must regain the dependence and or the control over the former Soviet board of republics. Russia should prevent the extension of NATO alongside its borders as best it could. Putin made this response the foundation of his domestic and foreign policy, which in part became the basis of his popularity. What I want to say is that there is a dialectical relationship between this particular consensus and Putin's policy, and actually this would reflect what most Russians wanted as well. So Putin, 2000 to 2010, I would say, consolidates his power and made the national consensus the basis of his own program for making Russia and himself great again. Putin's imperial domestic and foreign policy does not represent, I want to be very clear about this, does not represent a new direction, but rather reflects the widespread national consensus that Russia must be a great power again for its own security. So there are various geostrategic imperatives that flow from this that informs military policy and foreign policy as well. Russia must remain a nuclear superpower. Russia must act like a power in all facets of international activity. Russia must be the hegemon, the political, military, and economic leader of its region, the near abroad, former border republics of the USSR. Russia must oppose by any means necessary any power that threatens its sacred duty to be a great power again. Russia must. The US and the West will be the major opponents to Russia's manifest destiny to be a great power again. You can call this the Putin doctrine. He likes to call it that. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Make Russia strong, well-armed, a unified state under a strong leader. Rebuild the Russian nuclear arsenal and military. Focus on a common enemy, the United States and NATO. Support nationalists, and this is extremely important, I think, for an American audience. Support nationalists and right-wing populist movements in Europe and the USA in order to divide and conquer the unholy European Union and NATO alliance, as the patriarch Kirill would say in sermon after sermon, by the way. So Putin and the foreign policy consensus. For Putin and the Kremlin elite, the foreign policy consensus that precedes Putin, and he uses, marks a line in the sand beyond which Russia cannot retreat without losing its sense of pride and national identity. The result is Russian expansion and empire building. When I gave this presentation, or something like it, very different than the one I gave before to the council, by the way, I use this to show how the Russian army has been reloaded. I have to rethink that one after the miserable performance of the Russian army. Miserable, but very good for the Ukrainians so far. But I would have said that it's fully reloaded. It's reloaded, but perhaps with blank ammunition. So Putin's imperial dreams, let me say more about that. We are a victorious people, he would say. It is in our genes and our genetic makeup. This is what he plans to restore, the map that he's looking at. Putin's favorite imperial autocratic heroes have been resuscitated. I'll talk about that in a different context, but they are Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Joseph Stalin. All of them have been revived, resuscitated, and reglorified under Putin. And what's the common theme here with him? Each of these monarchs, each of these autocrats have been given credit by Russians as creating and protecting and expanding the Russian state ruthlessly, but for the security of Russia. Putin on the Soviet Union. You hear this a lot and you see it quoted a lot. First and foremost, it is worth acknowledging that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest political catastrophe of the century. Now, he does not mean the demise of the Soviet system, of the communist system. He means the demise of the Russian Empire. So Putin on Russia's eternal mission and manifest destiny. See if we can pour through this without getting lost in some of his rhetoric. This is a major presidential address in January of 2013, and he still holds to this. Our great mission is to restore and unite Russian civilization. In this state civilization, there are no national minorities called Ukrainians or Belarusians or Russians. And the principle of recognition of friend or foe is defined as a common culture and shared values. That is everybody that is not Ukrainian, is not Russian, is not Belarusian in this new empire, can be regarded as a potential foe or a friend. It depends. The civilizational identity is based on the preservation of Russian cultural dominance, the carriers of which are not only ethnic Russians, but all carriers of such identity, regardless of nationality. We may call this Eurasianism. So let me talk just a little bit about how this new Bonaparte can make such statements and make them believable by the people that he rules. The sinews, the muscle of Russia's power, of Putin's power. I call them the triumph of the Siloviki. I'll teach you a Russian word, Silovik. Silovik means strong man, and it refers to the police, the security services, and the military. So what we see in Putin is the triumph of the Siloviki from which he comes. He enjoys the strong support of the Siloviki, the strong men in all of these institutions, the officer corps of the armed forces, the police, and the security services. He has strong support of federal and provincial bureaucracies, including provincial governors. He has control of the State Duma and the State Council, the national legislature, through his own party, Russia United, and other parties that he's bought off. He has state control of the national media, which he's developed over the last 20 years, especially television. Most Russians get their news get their information from televisions. Support, he has the support of the oligarchs for the most part, for now. And he has support of the Russian Orthodox hierarchy, that he has support of the hierarchy that shepherds over 160 million people. He has the popular support down beyond that even, and I'll develop this theme a little bit, a little later. He is an autocrat, but he is an autocrat by consent of the governed. So Putin, the Silovik is the new Tsar. This is what Timothy Snyder has to say about it. Make of it what you will. Putin, a KGB officer from 1975 until 1991, extends the sadistic tradition of interrogators. Nothing is true, nothing is worthy of sacrifice, everything is a joke, everyone is for sale. Might makes right, only fools believe otherwise, and they should pay for being fools. So in consolidating his personal power, he had a number of potential and real enemies. Let me pick out just three as examples, but there could be hundreds that I could allude to. Boris Berezovsky, media mogul and early supporter of Putin, supporter of Yeltsin, and some argue is the man that was able to convince Yeltsin to bring Putin on and to put him forward as the next president of Russia. He was driven eventually because he thought he was as good and as equal in his power with Putin and would give him advice Putin did not want. He was eventually, his whole media empire was taken over and nationalized, that is put under the state, that is put under Putin, driven into exile and perhaps committed suicide in 2013 in London. Anna Politkovskaya, a very good example, a very bad example, I should say, of what happens to journalists that call Putin out or criticize any of his policies or anything else they say about Putin. An investigative journalist was murdered October the 20th, 2006. Democratic leaders murdered or neutralized. Boris Nemtsov, a Democratic leader, murdered February 2015. Since Putin became president in 2000, more than 50 journalists critical of his regime inside of Russia have been murdered. One in particular is interesting to talk about, I think. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, billionaire oil oligarch, who was supportive at first of Putin, but also began to talk about also running for president in 2004 and criticizing some of Putin's policies. And in a sense thought that he could either control Putin or replace Putin. He was a billionaire oligarch. He had the largest combine of filling stations, that is the gasoline primarily stations. He was in prison eventually, stripped of all of his assets. All of his assets were sold to the state and exiled to eventually, after getting out of prison, to Israel. The oil and gas assets, let me emphasize, of UCOS were confiscated and sold to the government, therefore directly under Putin's control. The domestic opponents have been a few prominent ones. I won't say much about Navalny, you've read that in the news. The Russian lawyer political and financial activist, politician, and presidential candidate, poisoned by the FSB in 2020. Charged falsely with corruption and tax and evasion when he survived this poisoning, and imprisoned and denied the right to run for president. Now, it seems that every dictator, every leader, perhaps every political leader, needs to have some kind of justificatory imperial ideology. And Putin has constructed just such an ideology to justify his expansive policy and his policy that comes under the rubric of Eurasianism. Revive and glorify great Russian national heroes of the past, like Grand Prince Alexander Nevsky, who stopped the Teutonic Knights in a famous battle on the ice. Revive the imperial ideology of the Tsarist regime based on autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. Revive and honor ruthless builders of state and empire in Russia, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Joseph Stalin. Boast of Russian exceptionalism as a victim, but as a defender against the West, and regard the West as Russia's permanent enemy. Promote Christian fascism, and I'll say a few words about that in a second, and Eurasianism of Ivan Ilyin and Alexander Dugin. Revive and refine Eurasian dreams of empire. Okay. Here are the two most important ideologues in this attempt of him to clad his actions in an expansive Eurasianist ideology. Very few people in the West have heard about the first one, but in some ways the most important one, Ivan Ilyin, who was opposed to the Bolsheviks, fled Russia, was a White Guard fighter against the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, and died in 1954, but was a great admirer of Hitler and of Mussolini. The other, Alexander Dugin, 1962 born, Putin's Rasputin, he's called. I'll say a word about that in a second. Dugin, his view is summed up. An important aspect of the Eurasian worldview is an absolute denial of Western civilization. In the opinion of the Eurasians, the West and its ideology of liberalism is an obsolete evil. I don't know how that got in there. I missed that. So, Ilyin's Russian fascism. Individuals are evil by nature and must be curbed by authoritarian leaders and governments, not by liberal democracies, which lead to disorder and anarchy. Individualism and personal liberty are Western views that undermine family and community. Russia is the eternal victim of the rapacious West, but God's last sacred refuge and hope. Tradition and church support autocratic regimes. Russian fascism, Ivan Ilyin and Vladimir Putin. Russian fascism is really a warmed up Ilyinism, and I'll say no more about that at this point. Alexander Dugin, the more current one, has had much more influence on people outside of the elite, into the intelligentsia certainly, and requires, I think, and has some connections with the alt-right throughout the world, even in the United States. Dugin's geopolitics and Eurasianism is summed up in his book called The Geopolitics of Eurasia. Liberal democracy is a Western atheistic creed deservedly now dying everywhere. The West has always opposed Russia, which is God's innocent nation that has suffered through centuries of invasion from East and West. Global power is shifting to Eurasia, destined to be ruled by Russia, from Dublin to Vladivostok. Only an authoritarian ruler under God can rule Eurasia. Dugin infers in interviews that Vladimir Putin is God's chosen, the true and worthy successor of Grand Prince Saint Vladimir the Great, who Christianized Russia in the 10th century, and the true choice of the Russian people to rule Russia and Eurasia is Vladimir Putin. Russia's military Russia's military schools, the Russian military is strongly influenced by Dugin's geopolitics. His foundations of geopolitics, Dugin calls the United States and Atlanticism to lose, calls for the United States and Atlanticism to lose their influence in Eurasia. The maximum task of the future is the Finlandization of all of Europe. All should be part of a sphere of influence with the source in Moscow. Adopted as a textbook in many Russian education institutions, this book is now being adopted throughout the educational system in Russia, as are the views of Ivan Ilyin. So the imperial vision of Dugin and Putin can be summarized thusly. Only the Russian people are virile enough to liberate all Eurasians from the countless genocidal schemes of both East and West. Thus, we seek to foster and augment and dominate the dominant role of Russia in world affairs by any means necessary. Putin on Eurasianism and empire, Russia has always felt herself to be a Eurasian country. Never can we forget that the greatest part of Russian territory is in Asia. The time has come to match words with deeds and do all that we can to develop our political and economic interests in our part of Asia. They resuscitate this view, by the way, Putin and Dugin, of Mackinder's heartland theory that was very popular in the British Empire early. And when he argued essentially that Great Britain would have to extend itself as well into Asia, largely because the shift will come now to the Eurasian heartland, and that will be the center of power for virtually the world. Dugin and his far-right friends, I'll say a word about that. He is closely associated with Stephen Bannon. They communicate with each other. They have met in Paris to discuss how they can influence alt-right politics throughout Europe. And they've actually done so, presented brochures that will help them do that, and have arranged for Putin and other tyrants around the world to subsidize the alt-right in Europe and perhaps even the United States. Well, sad note, I suppose, on the Darya Dugina assassination. She was very much a speaker for her father on television. She was assassinated, we don't know by whom, on the 20th of August, 2022. And here is Dugin's response to that after the usual tears and the usual, I think, quite genuine fatherly love lost. Go back to that. Russia has challenged the West as a civilization. Russia cannot win unless Putin orders full war mobilization. Only restoring greater Russia, that is the Eurasian Union. Can we become a credible global power? And that is precisely the position that's now taken by the Russian hawks as they're carping away at Putin over the counteroffensive in the Ukraine. Just a word about the Russian Orthodox Church and its traditional foundation of authority for the authoritarian state and nationalism. He is very close with Kirill. Kirill, by the way, we're pretty sure was a KGB agent, or at least a KGB stringer as a priest early in his life. He's gone up very fast with the support of the KGB, and the FSB spreads his word. An oligarch that's important in this relationship between church and state is Konstantin Maloviev, chairman of the Society of Development of Russian Historical Education, Double-Headed Eagle. That's the name of his organization, which spreads this notion of Eurasianism throughout the church hierarchy, but also throughout the supporters of the church throughout all of Russia. Down to the war in the Ukraine. The war in the Ukraine. For a number of people in the State Department, like Fiona Hill and others, have been projecting this war possibility since 2008, and certainly since 2014, when Russia annexed the Crimea. It is now upon us. It's important to understand that there are many Russian-speaking people. They would not call themselves Russians necessarily in the Ukraine. It's important to say too that for the most part, except for those in the Don region that has been occupied by the Russian army, many of these Russian speaking Ukrainians have supported the Ukrainian government in this time of invasion. Now, one of the weapons that he continues to use is the energy that's produced and sent throughout Europe. I won't say anything about that, except that it is an important factor in the way he has tried to woo other countries, some countries even within the European Union, and he's been fairly successful with some, like Hungary, away from any kind of alliance against the Russian invasion. This is the map today, and it shows the offensive, a successful counteroffensive in these two key and strategic areas. And in this area, I think that this will still be an area where where the Ukrainian army will successfully press, but we'll see how that will go. But this is the map today. So let me talk about how the Ukraine fits into Putin's dream of Eurasianism, and why Putin decided to invade Russia at this particular time. Why invade the Ukraine now? In his twilight years, Putin, 69, is determined to burnish his legacy of restoring Russia as an imperial power. Putin believed Russian military, that he had restored the Russian military and it was fighting fit. Putin's view that it is in top form, as he would say over and over again in preparation for this invasion, has proved to be not true. And I'll have a thing or two to say about that. It performed well in Syria, but that was a very different situation, and they were mostly fighting against Syrian civilians. The US has been confused and divided and in retreat from the world stage. This seemed just the moment to invade the Ukraine. Putin has in part replaced the US as the geopolitical arbiter in the Middle East and enjoyed the prestige thereof, even having good relations with Turkey and with Israel. He enjoys a stronger alliance, it would seem, with China. And the oil and gas prices were high and domestic opposition low in Russia itself. This could have been a diversionary tactic of his as well, as I'll say in a few minutes, against a diversionary tactic, trying to take the attention of the Russian people away from all of the things he has not done domestically to reform the Russian system that serves the Russian people so poorly. Ukraine, as a victim of Putin's Eurasian manifest destiny, I think is clear, and why it's there. What does he want? Snyder, I think, is right on this. He has a genocidal plan that would be carried out the same way Putin suppressed the opposition in Russia, but on a more massive scale, with gulags, mass transportation, plantation, re-education of peoples, and destruction of the Ukrainian intelligentsia and political leadership, which is precisely what Stalin did in the late 1930s that caused widespread famine and the destruction, really, of the Ukrainian elite. But this bear has bitten off quite a bit and is now suffering from indigestion. What do the Ukrainians want? The Ukrainians are not imposing their own vision on another nation. They are protecting their right to choose their own leaders against an invasion designed to undo their democracy and eliminate their society. Putin's megalomania and miscalculations, however, have played into the Ukraine's hands. He miscalculated the readiness, the willingness, and morale of the Russian military to fight. He miscalculated the willingness and determination of the Ukrainian people to defend the sovereignty of their country. He miscalculated the resolve of the Ukrainian government and the readiness of its military to fight. And he has miscalculated the willingness and resolve of the United States and Europe to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. He thought the army would be facing a house cat, and it is now facing a lion. What about China? The Sino-Russian China, what about China? Put that up again. I like that. What about China? The Sino-Russian alliance that has been developing since 1921 would seem to come to full fruition now with Chinese support of Russia. But wait a minute, there's another way to look at this. They have a shared vision, a shared political vision for world order provides the foundation for Chinese-Russian cooperation, absolutely. They have a common geopolitical ambition to expand in their own neighborhood and expand their empires of influence, economic and political. Go back. And a common enemy perceived, the United States, as keeping them from their manifest destinies. But there's a problem here, it seems to me, for Russia. Russia could emerge as China's vassal state, and in some ways it already is. Xi's Global Reach Belt and Road Initiative, look at what it challenges for Russia. In Russia's neighborhood, it's control over Kazakhstan, the whole areas that it is interested in. So if there's a marriage here, it's a marriage of convenience, very much like a Bismarckian marriage of convenience of the 19th century. China has its own imperial dreams, and they don't talk about this in public, but it includes expansion. It's at least an informal imperial expansion into Siberia and Asia, which is now China's main source of resources and main source of gas and oil. But it comes down to the people eventually in Russia, and particularly Siberia, to see the results of this. Protests as China's funded companies have moved into Lake Baikal, for example, and proposed to buy and funnel Lake Baikal water out to the world, has taken concessions all over the southern part of Siberia for lumber and minerals and that sort of thing for China's industrial development. So for the moment, it's a convenient alliance of two tyrants with imperial dreams, but these imperial dreams could very well conflict with each other. Is Russia and China drawing closer today? Xi and Putin have met again at a summit meeting with Asian leaders in Uzbekistan yesterday and today. What's come from that has not been very satisfying for Russia. Putin recognizes that China has questions and concerns and may not wholly support the invasion of Ukraine. President Xi is more subdued in the tone about alliance and did not repeat that the US and West are to blame for the conflict. China has done little to help Putin circumvent sanctions or help funnel advanced Western technology forbidden by sanctions into Russia. No talk at all at this meeting about China giving military aid of any sort to Russia. So the response is, Mr. Putin has severely undercut his leverage with China by cutting himself off from the West. and by so far losing the war, he is now he has nowhere else to turn but China. And the Chinese are best at looking after their own interest, as Sergei Rabchenko, professor of international relations at the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, has so wisely put it. This is the most prudent, most low-key statement from President Xi's about his part in the strategic relationship between the two countries, says Professor Xi in Renmin University, Beijing. And still, Putin is popular in Russian public opinion. But for how long? Public sentiment, again, I would remind you, is not a trivial matter. Russia is an autocracy, but it is an autocracy that depends on the support of the government. The latest Levada poll, and the Levada poll is an independent poll. And by the way, you know, Putin needs independent polls because he needs to know what actually is happening in Russia. The latest national poll by independent polling service Levada shows that Putin maintains an 80% approval. But the poll was made before the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive, and full effect of sanctions has been felt. Hundreds of thousands of potential opponents, largely educated young people, have fled Russia. The passive support is there in a strange sort of way. Of those 80% who approve, at least 30% lean towards support, but may change their mind if the sanctions hurt or if the invasion becomes more than a special military operation, a full-scale war, or ultimately loses the war altogether. Passive support, I think brilliantly, not brilliantly, but sadly, I suppose in some ways, made by this young woman in Moscow, very modern Millie, very modern Russian woman. Many in my generation associate the Soviet Union with long forced stability. Putin irritates me, but just let a foreigner try to criticize him. I always defend Russia. When I was in London, people constantly made fun of Russia and Russians' women, mocking them as mail order brides. No more politics for me. Of course, it's corrupt. I don't see the point in talking about something you can't control. It's better to know and be quiet. It's better not to speak up. Why spoil your mood? Opinion of a professional, and I dare not say whom or his or her name. I despise the oligarchs. Most Russians do, and of course I know that our politics are rotten. We're not stupid, you know, but Putin makes us proud to be Russian again. What about your president? What about your so-called democracy? Is Putin diverting or trying to divert from domestic problems? It's an issue that's relevant here in considering his popularity. A stagnating economy, he has. The decline of living standards, exacerbated by fluctuating and rising oil and gas prices and sanctions. The failure to reform the economy, where oligarchs dominate. Russians generally hate the oligarchs. More and more force and brutality required to repress the opposition. The responses to recent successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, it seems to me, may change what's going on internally in Russia and may begin to see the loss of the hearts and minds of the Russian people for Putin. There are breaks in Putin's propaganda machine. I'll talk a bit about that. Some hawkish Russian ultra-right commentators on state TV openly blame the military leaders and indirectly the commander-in-chief for the recent rout of the Russian army as a result of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. On Russian state television, where criticism of the Kremlin is rare, supporters of the war are increasingly pointing fingers over what they cast as a disorganized and insufficiently concerted invasion and a corrupt military. The sanctions are working. There's no question about this. This is something that Putin must worry about and is trying to neutralize, but so far has not been able to successfully do. Lifting sanctions would do serious damage to what little internal law can do, international law can do to discourage aggression. Lifting sanctions without Russian withdrawal from Ukraine would send the message that illegal conquest carries no significant legal penalty. Lifting sanctions would be tantamount, in my opinion, to recognizing and sanctioning Russian aggression. Lifting sanction is equivalent to appeasement. How the crisis in the Ukraine may end. There could be a disastrous quagmire or humiliating retreat for Russia and Putin, resulting in regime change in Russia. There could be violent regime change in Kiev if by some way Putin is victorious. Full conquest of Ukraine and integration into Russia if Russia is successful. A chaotic stumble into something like World War II, World War III would come, what Bismarck would call death by suicide. Or that the Ukraine negotiates its eastern provinces to Russia, the Donbass and the Crimea, which is what Professor of Foreign Policy at the University of Chicago, Paul Proust, argued on March the 2022. Ukraine's wins could make Russia more dangerous, however, warns James Stavridis. I'm ex-Navy, so this would be aye, sir, to me, a retired United States Navy admiral recently, and I think the Bloomberg has argued that a cornered Putin, a defeated Putin, may strike out with much greater might at the civilian population before he goes under. That could certainly happen. So let me summarize. The geopolitical consequences, as I see it, of a Russian victory, as I see it, as Timothy Snyder helps me see, Russia, an aging tyranny, seeks to destroy the Ukraine. Ukraine, a defiant democracy. A Russian victory would extend genocidal policies in Ukraine, subordinate Europeans, and render any vision of geopolitical European Union obsolete. A Ukrainian victory would confirm the principle of self-rule, allow the integration of Europe to proceed, and empower people of goodwill to return to reinvigorated to other global challenges. Can Putin survive defeat? Who can tell? I certainly wouldn't predict. Support of the provinces is still strong, with exception of some areas of Siberia. The Siloviki still strongly support him because if he goes down, they go down. Well, actually not. If he's replaced by someone else from the Siloviki, that system will not go down. The circle of oligarchs still support, but as sanctions cut into their empires abroad, their economic empires abroad, they may not. It may depend on how well the sanctions work and whether the alliance of the United States and European alliance, whether or not that alliance holds together. And it certainly will depend on who wins the war. Well, I'm going to end my comments with a few images. Disturbing, I hope. This is one of my favorite paintings of one of my favorite painters of war, a war correspondent and painter, Vasily Vereshchagin, of the Russo-Japanese War and the wars of Russia against the Central Asians, called the apotheosis of war. Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. God save Ukraine. I like to end my presentations on Russia with a picture like this, my favorite painting of Isaac Levitan, made in the Ukraine when it was the Ukraine and now the Ukraine. And here is a suggested reading list that I'll come back to. But first, next, ask if you have any questions or comments.
And I think we'll turn it over to Amy. I'm going to ask Amy if she has any questions in the chat box.
Yes, we do have a few questions.
Quite a long presentation. I hope everybody was able to, oh, here, I'll go like this. Hi.
There you are.
There I am. I hope everyone was able to absorb all of that. And so there might be some questions in the chat box. And I'll move my screen out of the way in case people want to look at this books and articles. And of course, this will be up on our website. People can go here for more information. Turning it back over to you, Amy.
Sure, great. So the first question is back to Dugin and Ilyin. The question is, do they speak to the strengths of Russia, and would their ideas have currency within Russia without the oil?
Without
Oil.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. It would have strength because of, I say, this perceived consensus and the fact that most Russians very much support Russia becoming a great power again. So their philosophy is in some ways a post factum, it's in some ways a post factum justification, building of an ideology in order to justify and defend this expansion of empire on the part of Putin and his philosophy of Eurasianism, which he gets from other people. He gets it from Dugin, he gets it from Ilyin. And the important thing about both of these philosophers is that they are very popular within certain communities, like the Siloviki and like the army, the military, because he's been a teacher and a professor at military schools. And it has become popular with the sort of right-leaning part of the Russian intelligentsia, but it is now being taught in schools. Their views are being taught in schools on Putin's order. So in essence, what he's done is to take their philosophy, modernize it, and weaponize it in his drive for empire.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what is the impact of Putin's purported health issues on his leadership in the long term?
I didn't, again, please.
The question is about the impact of Putin's health issues in terms of his long-term leadership.
Well, there are all sorts of rumors going around. Most of them strike me as wishful thinking, that he is extremely ill, and he may have had a spat of prostate cancer, which all of us have at his age, eventually. He may have had lung cancer. It's not clear yet. He did have this period of isolation during the COVID epidemic as it swept through Russia. But I don't see him as crazy. I certainly don't see him as mentally disturbed that much, except I would argue that he has developed a very bad case of megalomania. And in some ways, it reminds me of the megalomania that Hitler developed in the last year of the war, where he believed that everything that he thought, everything he said was absolutely true. And it must be true because he said it. And people act upon then what he says. And that has led him, that megalomania has led him to these miscalculations about this invasion and the fact that the invaded would not fight back and would collapse.
There are 2 or 3, I think 3 more questions.
Yes, yep.
And we'll have to shut it down.
All right, I have a few questions here. Is there a risk that the Ukraine, if successful in defeating Russia, would continue to fight and try to retake Crimea or invade elsewhere in Russia?
Successful in defeating Russia.
I think that the Ukrainian army, if it's successful, as successful as it has been in these 2 initiatives, specifically towards Kherson, and towards Kharkiv, will be successful in pressing up against the Donbass as well, and Russia's taking Donbass. I think it all depends on the resolution of the European and American alliance and the weaponry we're able to give them. I don't think that Putin will have the time to raise an army, and he does not want to go to a draft or anything of the sort. So I think that that the Ukrainian plan at this point, with the support of the allies and the weaponry that's being sent to them, I think it's very likely that they will push to retake the Crimea, and they will push to retake the Donbass. And the question is, what will Russia do in terms of using a nuclear device or something of that sort in response to that, if its army is not able to win on the ground, and it looks like it's not able to do that. But anything could happen.
And I think related to that, do you see any possibility for diplomacy and negotiations?
Not at this point. I don't think either side. I think certainly that Ukraine would not negotiate at this point, because why would they negotiate when they're winning ground? Much of the, for example, it comes from the French president, Macron, and others, in some ways are playing to their own right, or trying to blunt the criticism of their own right parties by pushing this negotiation, and others think that if Putin is cornered, that he'll use a nuclear weapon or something of that sort. In all kinds of conflicts like this, you don't negotiate unless you're winning or losing. So I don't see a negotiation as a negotiated peace likely to happen until Ukraine gains more ground.
And here's an interesting question. Historically, Eastern and Western Ukraine have been divided in culture, religion, and language. How much support is there in Eastern Ukraine for unification with Russia?
Okay, that's a very good question. I take a bit of umbrage with divided in culture. Ukrainians and the Russians are both Orthodox. The church split because of the Russian invasion in 2014. But they have much in common in culture. They have some common history. But I wouldn't say that that divide was great. There were people that welcomed the Ukrainians. Welcome the Russian army as they came in to support that. And there are people in the Donbass that are very strongly pro-Russian in their sense. But what is interesting in this part of the area, in the part of the area that's dominated by Russian speakers, for the most part, is their support for the Ukraine, for Ukraine, their support. So I think that the Ukraine has as much right to the Donbass, certainly as Russia has.
And I think our final question is, what do you make of the summit in Uzbekistan, in which the centerpiece is the meeting space? Oh, in the meeting space was an enormous coffin decorated with greenery.
Well, that coffin could very well be for you know what Stalin did when the Eastern Front, Western Front for Russia, but when the Eastern Front collapsed during the Blitzkrieg of the German army in 1941, is round up the generals and shoot them. I think the coffin is for a scapegoat amongst the military in the Russian army, because Putin will start looking for scapegoats now. The more dire this becomes. What's important about this meeting is that China did not give them a full voice endorsement for this invasion. In fact, quite the contrary. China seems to be backing away from it. And he did not get what he had hoped for, where Xi Jinping would say, well, yes, anything you want, we'll give you. They're not sending military aid. What they are getting from Russia and happy to have, and now Russia depends entirely on China for outside support. What they're getting is gas and oil on the cheap from Russia. So it has not been a good conference for Putin.
Great. And I guess one final comment. Yes, I think China looks at its partner Putin as a jumped up impulsive guy with a risky appetite, not in touch with facts on the ground. And that ends the comments and questions for tonight.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. I guess I have to just move the speaker out of the way. And thank everyone for coming to the presentation tonight. And we hope that you learned a few new things. And you can always join this again. You can always watch this again on our website. So thank you very much.
My greatest critic.
Yeah. All right. We'll see you next month, the fourth Thursday in October. And I don't have my program in front of me of our speaker, but it will be wonderful again. So we'll see you there. Okay. Bye-bye.